It's time to continue our lesson by Dr. Theophil Christen. Part 2. Exploitation. Those who attack an opponent objectively do well to admit freely anything that they consider correct in his arguments. We who believe in free economy declare expressly that we accept the socialists' criticism of the existing economic system. We condemn capitalistic exploitation of the workers, and we propose to examine its fundamental causes. The first writer, as far as we know, to reduce the characteristics of exploitation to a formula was the French social philosopher Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. In eloquent words, he pointed out the injustice of allowing property to be a source of income unconnected with any kind of work to its holder. This is the truth contained in his much debated aphorism, "Property is theft." Perhaps because of his paradoxical style, Proudhon has for 80 years been ignored and misunderstood. Nevertheless, it is impossible to dispute his proposition, which we shall now examine more closely, that unearned income is an economic injustice. Let us imagine the whole produce of 1 year's work and 1 year's services represented by a great block, figure 1. In economic justice, the block should be divided among all those who have worked. Those who have contributed nothing to the block should receive nothing at its distribution. This fundamental proposition of socialism is simple justice. But how is it with the actual distribution? The produce of the year's work is sold for money, and work or service is rewarded by money. Those who take part in the distribution of the block must pay money. The produce of the year's work is sold for money, and work or service is rewarded by money. Those who take part in the distribution of the block must pay money. How do they obtain it? Here we find two groups. The first group has obtained its money as wages, in the widest sense, in return for the surrender of produce or for service. The other group has received its money as interest on capital, either as interest on loan money or as rent. Wage earners work for their income. Receivers of interest have an income without work. In civilized countries, the total of wages is about equal to the total of interest. Professor Bowley of London University gives the following estimate for England for the year 1911. Unearned income, rent, interest, dividends, is 42% of the total income. Earned income, wages, salaries, etc., is 58% of the total income. Receivers of interest can therefore buy about half the produce block in figure 1. For the wage earners, only the other half remains. If there were no receivers of interest, the wage earners could buy the whole block, and this would be economic justice. The existence of the block is due to the workers alone, but at its distribution they must surrender half their share to the owners of property. We have therefore divided the block into two parts, marked W for wages and I for interest. The injustice of such a distribution of the product of labor is apparent. With such a system, we cannot speak of free competition, or of a free play of economic forces, for only the forces of exploitation have free play, never the forces of production. That this injustice in the distribution of the product of labor is quite as extreme in the United States as in any other country is proved by the following striking quotation from Daisy Lee Worthington Worcester, quoted in the Literary Digest, February 16, 1929. The figures are taken from the reports of the Federal Trade Commission. Quote, "We look again at the United States, the 20th century crucis. Wealth, vast quantities of wealth, enough to abolish poverty throughout the land. 90% of this wealth owned by 13% of the people. 1% of the people owning 59% of it. 77% of the people owning no smallest portion of it. 50% of the national income going to capital. Nowhere in all the land any evidence of a single industrial group in which the annual income of a wage earner is sufficient to enable him to support a wife and 3 small children, in accordance with the low standard set by a group of employers. The average wage for the country as a whole, $1,280 a year, dooming the worker, who is the father of dependent children, to chronic want, forcing him into an acceptance of public or private charity in the event of any of the ordinary disasters of life, unemployment, sickness, death, and these same charities quadrupling, quintupling their budgets in a single decade. This is the richest nation on earth. This, our amazing prosperity. In the meantime, one of those ordinary disasters in the life of the worker in the capitalistic era, unemployment, has recurred in the United States of America in a gigantic measure. A general economic depression has thrown more than 10 million laborers and uncounted millions of workers in the professions into the misery of unemployment. Thousands of banks, tens of thousands of businesses, hundreds of thousands of farmers went bankrupt. Millions lost their savings, their homes, everything they had. 6 years, up to now, of economic depression have shifted wealth amounting to millions of dollars from the debtor class to the creditor class, and contributed to a further increase of maldistribution of wealth beyond the figures indicated above. The figures for England given by Sir L. Chiozza Money, Riches and Poverty 1911, are still more conclusive evidence of exploitation. Of the national wealth of England, 90% is possessed by 4% of the population, and 10% by 90% of the population. A very simple calculation shows whether an individual is a victim or a beneficiary of unearned income. The total income of the United States in the year 1918 was, for example, $58 billion, of which 40 to 50% was unearned income. Unearned income, therefore, amounted to at least $23.2 billion, or with a population of 104,200,000 to $223 per head of the population. This is the amount of the annual tribute paid by the worker to the non-working capitalist, directly in the form of rent, and indirectly as rent and interest in the price of everything he buys. If we take the case of a worker with a wife and 2 children, his share of the burden of unearned income is 4 times 223, or $892, which, with interest at 5%, represents a capital of $17,840. If the worker possesses less capital than this, he is a victim of interest, paying more rent and interest than he receives. Only if he accumulates more than $17,840 capital does he begin to benefit by interest. But how many workers possess this amount of capital when 77% of the people own no smallest portion of the national wealth? The overwhelming majority of the population are victims, not beneficiaries of unearned incomes. For England, the United Kingdom, the figures for 1919 to 1920 are as follows. Population, 46 million. Total income, 3,900 million pounds. Unearned income, 40% of this, or 1,560 million pounds. Thus, the burden of unearned income is 34 pounds per head of the population. With interest at 5%, 34 pounds interest means a capital of 680 pounds. So, the worker only ceases to be a victim of interest after he has accumulated a capital of 680 pounds. The figures for both the United States and England are taken from an article by Professor Popovich in the Economic Journal, March 1926. The aim of socialism is to abolish such exploitation, and this aim we approve. It is only the socialist method, namely the nationalization of production, that we reject. We wish to state at once that it is impossible to abolish or restrict interest by law. We shall return to this later. End of Part 2.